Professor of Political Science and Women's Studies, Chair of the Political Science Department, and Coordinator of the Women's Studies Program at the University of New Hampshire. She's the author of 5 books, Jewish Feminism and Intersectionality, and I think you're going to read some books today, is that correct? That's the newest one. The Jewish Phenomenon in Sub-Saharan Africa, which she talked about this morning. Democratic Theorizing at the Margins, Cornerstones of Peace, Jewish Identity, Politics, and Democratic Theory, and my favorite title, The Family Flamboyant, Race, Politics, Queer Families, and Jewish Life. Isn't that a great title, The Family Flamboyant? She's also the editor of the anthology, The Narrow Bridge, Jewish Views on Multiculturalism. So we're very happy to have Professor Brettschneider with us today. Joining us on the panel is OSU's own Professor Lynn, you know what? I wrote Lynn Kay, Assistant Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, who's a scholar of rabbinic literature and Jewish law and thought. Also joining us is our graduate student, Jonathan Brandman, who I think inspired this panel. Aren't you very much behind kind of putting it together?
Yes, I'm very grateful to the department for encouraging this kind of dialogue.
All right. We're going to give the panelists about 10 minutes to speak or to read something, and then we think there's going to be a lot to talk about, so we hope to have lots of discussion. Okay, Marla.
Oh, I'm first. Sure.
Go for it.
Great, thank you. Hi, it's so nice to be here. All right, so we're asked to just sort of give some opening comments, which I'm delighted to do. I'm going to read like a page or so from the conclusion of this book because I hope not to talk all that much about those subjects once we get to the conversation, but I'll talk about whatever you want me to talk about. And mostly the point with this is that, I mean, one, I think, which will have this in the conversation, the study of Jews, Jewish feminism, Jewish issues is important in its own right. Jews are a community with as much diversity as any community, and in that diversity, lots of our own particular ways of doing things, and it seems to me any feminist wants to understand different communities. Certainly we have a history, past, present, and probably future, of anti-Semitism. Feminists care about oppression, and Jews have long been involved in a host of, and at the forefront of a host of radical progressive organizations. And as feminists, we often like to see people in resistive movements and alternative ways of being. One of the things, even if you could care less about Jews, it would seem to me feminists really need to study Jewish issues, paradigms, history, because in my experience, one of the things is when we learn about another community and another community's ways of understanding things and doing things, we not only learn about the other community, but we also learn about the ways that, and we talked a little bit this morning, about the ways that it shows us things that we never saw in dominant paradigms. And it opens up questions, opens up new ways and insights, new ways of seeing insights into things we might have been studying before that we couldn't have seen if we weren't exposed to an alternative way of being with different kinds of subaltern groups. So, I mean, in general, it just seems like totally obvious to me that even if you don't particularly have a relationship with Jews, Jewish community, Jewish history, anti-Semitism, etc., those, you know, that's just pretty obvious to me. But I'm just going to read from the, so this is a new book. It's actually not fully out. This is an advanced hard copy. The full run with the paperback is going to be out soon, Jewish Feminism and Intersectionality. Part of the reason for doing this book is because, as we're going to get to, at this point in history, this has not always been the case, but in feminist studies, there's almost no attention to Jewish feminism and Jewish issues. And intersectionality, for good and bad, is a current buzzword. I feel very old when I say this, but it's the current buzzword. So as you heard with one of my earlier books, like nearly 30 years ago, I did a book on Jewish issues and multiculturalism. Because multiculturalism was the buzzword back then. There's not really all that much difference between intersectionality. Intersectionality has been around actually a long time. It's only more recently become a very popular public buzzword. So I did a book back then because as much as Jews were involved in that as activists and academics, there wasn't really attention to Jewish issues in multiculturalism as a field. So I did that book back then. I feel sort of like deja vu. When you get old enough, it all seems to come around, like your old pants, you know, they come back into fashion kind of thing. So after years of being like, oh my God, here we go again, I kind of just went around and did the next book on Jewish feminism and intersectionality. The book doesn't do this long critique of the absence. What I just do is I just do my own kind of work to suggest or demonstrate different ways that Jewish feminism can and ought to be done and included in this kind of stuff. But so I conclude, it's a tough book. I'm criticizing, I take on my own community as much as I take on lots of other kinds of things, provide multivalent analyses. But, so this is the way I end it. Anti-Semitism is deadly. One could certainly not call anti-Semitism a thing of the past internationally, given the high levels of public anti-Semitic acts and destruction globally, and we're at pretty much a near all-time high. And for those who consider anti-Semitism a thing of the past in the United States, check again. You might not have been paying attention, but check again. While most U.S. Jews that view that a certain other minority groups face more discrimination than they do. This is a Pew study, not actually a Jewish study, not that that matters, but nearly half of all self-identified Jews in the United States say that they experience a lot, as opposed to some or none, discrimination. So having been raised as a Jew in New York City, so I have not necessarily had the same experience as some other Jews, I'm really still shocked when I hear about the levels of anti-Semitism my students face on a really quite progressive campus, but a campus with very few Jews. I cannot believe what they go through. I didn't have to go through that. I've mostly been in places until now where there were lots of Jews. Also, right now I live in a progressive, pretty interesting, multiracial New England city, but my kids have basically been the only Jews in their school. And so the levels of anti-Semitism that my kids face every day, including racism, homophobia, sexism, is like astonishing to me. It's like I had to learn how much this is still operative because I've been surrounded in these little Jewish enclaves. So the lack of attention in intersectionality studies to Jewish issues of concern is unacceptable. We need to redirect social justice efforts to include them. Avoiding Jewish matters only reinforces the status quo in many ways, including, and I'm happy to talk about in more detail on any of these ideas, including assimilationist paradigms for what we think of as the good stuff in the United States, like freedom, justice, and equality. And I've written extensively elsewhere on U.S. paradigms of things like freedom and equality and how they're actually imperialist concepts and somewhat genocidal. Further, avoiding Jewish critiques of Christian privilege and Christian hegemony in the United States is ruinous. As progressives, feminists, queer, class, and anti-racist scholars and activists, we're inching along in our efforts at dealing with straight privilege, white privilege, class privilege, thin privilege, heteronormativity, as well as hierarchies based on English language access, nationality, culture, and religion. But we're almost nowhere on the road of dealing with Christian privilege. The Christian right grows in influence into mainstream segments of U.S. society. Some of what's on my mind is reproductive rights issues. But you may not know about the vast sums, and we have Cindy here, and probably Cindy hasn't even studied this, although she's one of the experts on certain kinds of activities of the Christian right. The vast sums of funding from Christian right organizations put into advertising into Jewish audiences are threatening to all, not just Jews, but to all those who care about democracy. Christian far-right groups' attempts to influence the politics of Maine area now as Jewish students on campuses across the country are aimed in large part at breaking the historic, which you might not even know about, but I'll tell you, the historic Jewish Democratic Party affiliation. U.S. Jews come in second and have historically come in second only to African Americans in their support for the Democratic Party. So there's all this talk about Jews as right-wing, whatever. I don't know where you all get that. That's part of the anti-Semitic rhetoric. Again, not that the Democratic Party is like some wonderful land of like radicalism, but for the most part, in the way that we associate it with party politics and a two-party system in the United States, the values of the Democratic Party more likely resonate with intersectionality politics and feminist context than other things. And so there's been this enormous influx of Christian money to break the so-called Jewish Democratic Party relationship, and it's moved on to college campuses. It's unbelievable. So Christian right groups also seek, and may or may not get to talk about this, seek to shift Jewish public opinion away from critique of Israeli government policies. It serves the Christian right, you may not have thought about this in this way, but that's why I'm here, and fatal U.S. foreign policy for U.S. Americans to continue to incorrectly think, because you might have thought it's true, incorrectly think that U.S. Jews are so powerful, steadfastly pro-Israel government policy, and that any critique thereof is anti-Jewish and threatening to the United States. This is what you're doing all the time in the media. Okay? I'm here to remind you, decade after decade, Jewish population studies in the United States demonstrate that the vast majority of U.S. Jews are critical of Israeli government policy regarding Palestine and the Palestinians. It's actually in jeopardy, and it's astonishing to me that that remains the case, that the vast majority of U.S. Jews are critical of these policies, because in the last 20 to 30 years of the flood of Christian right money being poured into so-called pro-Israel government propaganda. If U.S. Jews were as powerful as they're portrayed by the left and the right in the United States, there couldn't be such a skewed understanding of Jewish values and actual Jewish concerns. The Christian right is not supporting a U.S. Jewish and Israeli actions to end war and injustice in Israel and Palestine. The U.S. Christian agenda directly jeopardizes the values of most U.S. Jews and other activists seeking peace and a just transformation in Israel and Palestine. I'm going to wrap this up in a minute. In other areas, pardon me, both domestic and international, U.S. Jews and Jewish groups remain at the forefront. Again, you may not know this, some of you who are old may know this, or remain at the forefront of a host of progressive to radical movements, LGBT, anti-racism, feminist, labor, humane immigration policies, public school. I'm happy to give you examples and talk about any of these. Food insecurity, environmental and sustainability efforts, war, peace, and more. The threat to free speech in public education from Christian right creationist activism, protect Christmas efforts, anti-divorce organizations, Pray the Gay Away, and ex-gay groups is extreme. The rise in anti-Muslimness in the United States is not only a threat for Muslims and those who care about them, it's part of an effort to reclaim the United States as a Christian. For these and so many reasons, intersectionality theorists will do well to include Jewish views and critiques in Christian privilege and Christian hegemony within the purview of analysis in the field. So, okay, that's plenty of time.
I'm delighted to be here. I study rabbinic literature. I'm part of the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. So academically, where I've come from is a lot of years of studying ancient languages and law and legal theory and law and literature. But where I'm increasingly finding a convergence now of my personal commitments and history and my academic research is in feminism, women's gender studies within these ancient cultures and how the ancient literatures are being received in contemporary Jewish populations, and how they're being interpreted, and how Jewish people are making meaning in their lives, both within their personal constellation of identities around their gender or their sexuality or other aspects of their identity outside their Jewish identity, and then especially within what it means to be part of Jewish communities that sometimes have norms that are at odds and make their own kinds of other identities uncomfortable. I'm interested increasingly in how Jews like this are navigating the fact that they have multiple identities that are not being read right by other people. And sometimes they're not being read right by fellow feminists, and sometimes they're not being read right by fellow Jews, but somehow these things make sense to them and aren't quite making sense to others. And this is just one thing. I'm so excited to be here because what I really like to do, and I'm trying to do through meeting people like you and meeting John and Marla, is to learn better language for me to be able to explain and understand what I am seeing, because academically I didn't come through this. So I'm just happy to be in this space with you, and I'm really grateful for you having this happen, and I really look forward to speaking more with you. I could say one more thing. The other thing that I'm working on is, and again, I don't have a direct answer for your concerns within your field about what Jewishness means for you. What I want to be is a person who does Jewish studies who's really happy to be in this conversation with you and can learn from you as you're doing your thing and help in anything that I might know. So I'll just say another thing that I was working on recently was there are these stories in this corpus of Jewish law from around the year 200 to 600, which is still very influential today in Jewish people's lives. So there's these stories, not only, they don't just have rules, but they have stories of people coming before Jewish courts, and they learn law from what happens in front of those Jewish courts. And I was noticing that when women are described coming forward and bringing a complaint in front of a rabbinic law court, they are very often introduced as crying in a way that male petitioners are not. And there's a few other ways that I was realizing that women's voices are being filtered, silenced, co-opted, narrated, heard, and then put back out to the receiving audience of these authoritative texts, how women are. Again, of course, women are not just one category, and I am aware of and increasingly aware of how I sound so outdated, so please know that I know that. I'm working really hard, but I'm just going to speak in what I know currently and totally happy to be expanded and improved upon. But what I realized was that in some parts of Jewish feminism today, what people sometimes are working on is get women to be able to do things that the traditional religion didn't let them do. Like now they can be rabbis. But as long as there isn't an attention, enough of an attention to the subtleties of constructions of women in much more nuanced ways within those same authoritative texts, I am very concerned about the abilities to move towards greater participation. And that's just in the very hammer, not nuanced, nice paintbrush kind of way. But that's where I'm up to now.
So thank you all again for being here. My section will focus on some of the specific ways that I try to address Jewishness in the classroom when I teach. Something that I've realized after, now this is my 4th year in the program, I really think many students could go through our entire undergraduate and graduate curriculum and never once know that there is such a thing as Jewish feminism, or discuss any topic of anti-Semitism or Jewishness as like an axis of experience in any of our classes. And I think that reflects broader trends in the US and in the feminist movement generally, so it's not a specific criticism against our department, but it's something that I am excited to try to change, and thank you all for also being interested. So when I design a course, there are a number of topics that I always try to hit because I assume that our students who are here for one GE course, this is their one exposure. So for me, those topics include indigeneity, trans and intersex topics, police violence, the prison system, and intersectionality, including an awareness of the complicated face of Jewishness and anti-Semitism in today's world, and especially in the US. And so if I want my students to know some stuff about Jews, what do I want them to know about Jews? It's really my goal for students to leave the course first of all, understanding, as Marla said, that anti-Semitic violence and stigma continue in the present, both in the US and abroad. To understand how anti-Semitic violence and stigma both resonate with other forms of racism and in some cases are co-produced out of the same histories, and also how they differ in important ways. To complicate understandings of Jewishness and race, first of all, as an Ashkenazi Jew, and Ashkenazi means European descended, to have students be aware of the complicated history of even white-skinned Jews in relation to whiteness, but also, as Marla's research really delves into, to understand that actually the numerical majority of Jews in the world are people of color, both in the US and then also definitely abroad. And also to understand how anti-Semitism and all forms of racism are bound up in both sexual and gender stigma. So, the way I like to go about this is not to have, Jew Day or anything like that in my curriculum. That's not how we do it. What I prefer to do is to integrate these topics into the other course concepts that I'm trying to convey to students. So topics such as the idea that race and gender are not natural and innate, but socially constructed. The idea that racial, gender, and sexual stigma all co-construct, or explaining intersectionality. So what I'm going to do on the following slides is just give examples of how when I'm teaching these broader topics, I integrate Jewish examples. I also realize, as Marla said, that I talk very fast. Am I talking too fast? No. Okay. It's a Jewish thing. So for those of us who've been teaching to students the idea that race is not biological but a social construction, it's often very hard to get students to grasp that in a concrete way. And one way to do that is to give examples of how racial categories in the US have shifted and changed over time. And I usually do that with the examples of the Irish and the Jews. So sometimes just putting a title like this on screen, students are like, what? What do you mean became white? What does that mean? But it's also very valuable to include images like this. So this is like an example of a medical drawing from the late 1800s, so that students can see the way that racial categories such as the Irish were like envisioned in the most official medical science in a different way than they are today. And I also include this kind of image, like from Nazi propaganda, in which you have a Jew who's not only drawn as black, but as specifically sexually menacing a white Christian woman. I also love to include this comic. This is an 1895 comic of an African person, a Jew, and a Native American, because again, it's often jarring for students to see ethnic groups grouped in this way that is unfamiliar to them in the present. I also include this photograph of a 1923 banner that was hung at NYU, which is now funny for people to think of New York as like an anti-Semitic place, but it says, you know, Jews get out, keep NYU a white man's college. So these types of images are, I have found useful in driving home to students the reality that racial categories change over time and integrating Jewish examples into that. In terms of teaching the idea that race, gender, and sexuality are all co-constructed through each other, what I always do is teach side by side lessons on the racial, gender, and sexual stigmas against African descended people and against European Jews so that students can see the resonances and differences. Probably many of us are familiar with the history of sexual and gender stigmas on African and African descended people, the ideas of sexual excess, sexual disease, hyperfertility, and the types of violence or exploitation that then get justified based off these stereotypes. So after doing a day on this topic, I also will do a day educating students about the history of gender and sexual stigmas against Jews. And I do want to include some specifics here because I think this is a topic that not many people in women's studies are as familiar with. So for a great deal of Jewish history, and even I would argue into the present, part of the racial and religious stigma against Jews was the claim that Jewish men are like gender inverts and effeminate. And part of that comes out of the time before circumcision was a regular practice, and there was a real Christian fascination with Jewish men's genitals, much in the way that there's often a fascination with like queer people or trans people, like what are you really cutting down there, what do you really have down there, are you even really a man? So part of that was the myth that Jewish men menstruated. So there are these very interesting transcripts from the Spanish Inquisition where you can read inquisitors being like, it's hard to spot a Jew, you know, by their face, but check if he's menstruating. I don't know how well that works for them. Also, like African Americans and like Asian Americans, Jews have historically been accused of transmitting syphilis and other disease. Also, Jews have specifically been accused of being sexual predators. Some of you have maybe heard of the blood libel, which was the accusation, as drawn in this lovely painting from the 1300s, that Jewish men kidnap Christian children, sexually torture them, and drink the blood to replenish the blood that we supposedly lose through menstruation. Because apparently this is what they think Jews do in our spare time between grad school readings. In terms of Jewish women likewise have been historically stereotyped, especially in Nazi ideology, as hypersexual, as whores, as therefore racial threats in the sense of supposedly seducing Aryan men and then like infecting the racial stock with stealth Jews who could pass. Accused of being overly aggressive and mannish. I would say we can even still see this in the stereotype of the Jap, the Jewish American princess. Often stereotyped in ways similar to how lesbians are stereotyped in the present, as either like terribly ugly or demonically seductive. And one example of this is actually Betty Boop. I totally encourage you all to check out the scholarship of Amelia Holberg, but Betty Boop is a very interesting example of a cartoon character who in some cases actually, like there is Yiddish and Hebrew writing in her home in the original cartoons, and she is, you know, she's not a good girl, and we could like deconstruct what that means, but part of the way she's portrayed as this out of control, lascivious woman is that she's originally a Jewish character. And when teaching this topic, I always conclude with this image of a Nazi propaganda poster from the 1930s, and it's, I mean, students always have this reaction of like, because this looks like every stranger danger poster we've ever seen as kids, many of which are inspired by homophobia, but which also descend from this older tradition of Jews being portrayed as like the creepy people sexually preying on Aryan children. And this, I always conclude this topic with this example because it really clarifies to students how this discourse of like racialized gender and sexual stigma gets used to incite violence. And so for my final point, in terms of the way I teach intersectionality, on one hand, when teaching about white privilege, to sort of disarm white students' resistance, I talk about my family's own kind of access to white privilege, which has depended on my grandfathers on both sides getting access to the post-World War II GI Bill, which was only for white veterans. And so my mother is deaf, and the reason that she can talk is that in the 1950s her family could afford hearing aids because of their new class status, because of the economic opportunities that were only available to white veterans like my grandfather. So that's an example I give. But I also really emphasize to students that even in the present, Jews are targeted for racial violence. And so I give this example, this was 2 or 3 years ago, of the Overland Park Jewish Community Center shooting, where a US veteran went into this community center, shot a couple people, killed them, and then in court said, I didn't need to kill any people, only Jews. I also advise students that that's not how you should defend yourself if you're on trial for murder. But I use this as an example to exemplify how Jews in the US kind of unzip some of the packet of privileges that we are used to associating with whiteness. If we often talk about whiteness as both structural access to economic, educational, and health opportunities, and also safety from stigma and violence, Jewish experience in the US often unzips that. So for example, this Jewish community center was located in a middle-class suburb where many Jews are able to live because of our access to whiteness, and simultaneously is a target for consistent racialized violence, which by the way often repurposes state military training and weapons when people use them in neo-Nazi settings. So to conclude my section, I just want to put up here some texts that are really teachable. First of all, I live for this book even more than I live for RuPaul. Yours in Struggle, 3 feminist perspectives on racism and anti-Semitism. I hyperventilated a little bit the first time I saw that title. I really encourage you to read it. It's written in very accessible ways and is a conversation between Barbara Smith, one of the best-known black feminists, Ali Boken, who is a Jewish feminist, and Minnie Bruce Pratt, who identifies as Christian and white. The Jew's Body by Sandra Gilman, Gender and Assimilation, Unheroic Conduct, How Jews Became White Folks are all really wonderful texts about Jewish entry into whiteness and how both Jewish darkening and lightening have always depended on different types of gender and sexual stigma and on gender and sexual conformity. And finally, in terms of complicating Jewish racialization further, thinking both about Jews of color and the complicated status of even white-skinned Jews and whiteness, I highly recommend Melanie K. Kantrowitz, The Colors of the Jews, and Marla Brettschneider's The Family Flamboyant and Jewish Feminism and Intersectionality. And I would be very happy to share these texts with all of you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. We're moving to questions, and I'll begin by asking you about intersectionality and your book, and it's both certainly that I need to read. When we think about intersectionality, we should think about categories, and some of the categories around Jewishness actually get blurred. So religion, race, nation aren't separate categories. And so thinking of that kind of complication, I'm wondering specifically what thinking through Jewishness, how that helps us expand our notion of intersectionality.
First of all, I want to spend the next 3 days talking to them. and a lot of great stuff that they said. All right, what am I gonna? Okay, one thing I'm gonna say is Jewishness blurs the boundaries because, like any community, Jewishness is complicated and nuanced and multifaceted, and in part because intersectionality has been largely constructed without any influence of Jewish experience. And so, as you know, then it's going to leave out paradigms and conceptualizations that reflect community. And so one of the reasons I want you to be studying Jewish feminism and your work on intersectionality is that the point of when you do that is that it's going to blow up your existing paradigms. And so, and that's good, you know, at least in my experience, that's what, that's the kind of feminist studies that I like and want to promote my students and my colleagues. I want them to do the kind of Jewish studies that like undo paradigms and redo paradigms and make new connections. And right now you're not, if you're not doing Jewish feminism, then you're not doing that. Your work is partial, your work is incomplete, and also, I don't mean just you, like I get to talk more because I'm a senior and no one here is like reading my papers or whatever. So it's not just you, it's just in general. When you're not doing it, mostly a lot of your work is wrong. Just like if you imagine if you just left out LGBT stuff and you're trying to do something about sexuality, your work would be partial, incomplete, and it would be wrong. If you don't do Jews, your work is going to be partial, incomplete, and it's going to be wrong. right? Because Jews are so central to the categories of diversity and difference in so many ways. And so also what we want to do with this is that we want to see the ways that things get to be brought together in relationship. So, for example, I'm going to give you an example. If we weren't taking into account the anti-Muslim scourge and really understanding that critically, we would probably not be able to see the deeper levels of the development of criminalization of Latinas in the United States in terms of border wars, cheap labor from the South, NAFTA, etc. The experience that happened after 9/11 with the new whole idea about citizenship and criminalization of Muslims has allowed scholarship by and about Latinas to do magnificent work on citizenship and criminalization. If we didn't do that, we wouldn't really be able to understand Black Lives Matter and African American understandings of new forms of criminalization and what a lot of people call new forms of slavery and actually even genocide. And so if you're not going to take into account all of these imbricating ways that we need to appeal to different histories, sometimes targeted at different regions or different demographics or different kinds of stereotypes, we have to take into account all that diversity, and they help us really understand the mutually constitutive, theoretical, and applied discourses that operate, right? So if you're not taking on this really central category of Jewishness, which, and if you need me to explain to you why I consider it central, I'm happy to do that. But if we don't understand Jewishness and anti-Semitism, then we're likely to think, going back to my original example, that things like criminalization, sterilization, eugenics, English-only policies, exoticization, deportation, sexual perversion, you name it, the current things that we're interested in intersectionality, colonialism abroad, imperialism at home, we're likely to think they're new. And we're likely to do studies on them that only get so far and only get so deep. Each of these, as also John mentioned, has a long history in the United States, let alone in Europe, of being used specifically against Jews in the United States, and as I mentioned, including today. So one of my favorite examples, of course, just to make it really pithy for you, is Emma Goldman. Okay? So take all of those issues that I laid out as some of the issues we care about intersectionality. Emma Goldman was considered the most dangerous woman in America, criminalized literally and figuratively, fighting against anti-Jewish sterilization and eugenic policies and propaganda, sexual promiscuity, the way she was presented as a sexual predator, pressure to function in English and become Americanized in order to combat her constant jailing, etc., as well as linking U.S. workers with international struggles and ultimately deported. Now, so I just laid out an array of communities, an array of concerns that we had, and I can tell you all of them have roots in the Christian right and liberal policies in the United States, practicing on many of those communities for a long time, and practicing, which you probably have not studied, practicing on Jews, right? And so if you don't understand the ways that they practiced on Jews and reformulated the stereotypes and remobilized some of the policies and adapted some of this stuff, then you're not going to understand the other kinds of communities, the policies, stereotypes, etc., that you're going to want to understand. So again, I say, so I'll just sort of leave it there, but I hate to say it, partial, incomplete, and simply wrong, right? Which is what we know. Don't hear about this. You already know that. If you tried to study diversity and feminist studies in the United States and you did not include African heritage people, who's going to take your work seriously, right? You know it's just simply incomplete, partial, and it's going to be wrong. You're not going to understand it. You're not going to understand the dynamic, right? Right now you're leaving out Jews, and I say that implications are similar.
Thank you, Marla. And to build off of that, I think one of the specific ways that intersectionality can be enriched by thinking about Jewishness is that we often talk about intersectionality, understanding that people can be simultaneously privileged and oppressed through different axes of identity, such as like, I am gay and I am a man, so I can access privilege and oppression at once. We talk less often about the way that a single identity can expose you simultaneously to privilege and oppression. And that is how, certainly I experienced Jewishness in the US, but I would say probably for lots of people. And I think that's a way of looking at intersectionality that we don't often teach to our students, and that our students then leave practicing an analysis of the world and practicing a politics and an activism that is not informed by that awareness. also to build on Marla's point about how deep these things go, something that was really fascinating for me to learn, that I learned from a Jewish studies book and not from something in feminist theory, was the theological origin of the practice of abducting indigenous American children and putting them in Christian schools, which is something that we talk about a lot. So in the 14 and 1500s in South America, where this practice originated in the New World, the specific theological justification came from the Council of Trent, which I believe was in 600 AD, so like way back. And the specific argument was that it is valid for Christians to abduct Jewish and Muslim children from their homes because it is the job of a rational person to exert parenting responsibilities for an irrational person. And of course, any rational person would see that Jesus Christ is the Savior, and therefore anyone who does not agree with that is irrational, and Christians must do whatever is best for them. And that was the justification given many centuries earlier for abducting Jewish and Muslim children and putting them in Christian schools. And that, we'd love to talk about citation, like who are you citing in academia? Well, that's who they were citing in South America when that practice was instituted. And so to think about the ways that like specific practices of segregation, indoctrination, colonization, proselytization, hierarchization, the way that these, to use Marla's words, practice, to think about the ways that many different types of discrimination are all constructed in conversation with each other, not just in terms of the stigmas, but the specific legal, theological, and racial practices, that they all build off of each other in conversation, not with any one single origin point, but that I would argue we are not as comprehensive as we can be if Jewishness is not part of the conversation. And the way I like to think of this is actually like, if you've ever seen the like mosaics of arabesques on the roofs of mosques, to think of these types of oppression as things that are all interacting with each other.
And quickly just say, and so those practices are not over. They're certainly not over for Native American children. They're not over for Jewish children in the United States. The adoption world and the family flamboyant, I talk a lot about this, about the need to, almost every I'm pro-adoption, but almost every adoption set of records is almost always forged in the United States, and especially if there's a Jewish parent. Jewish kids will not get adopted. Kids of Jewish parents will not get adopted in the United States, and Jewish parents trying to adopt kids, unless you're in a city where you can work with a Jewish adoption agency, you mostly cannot adopt kids. Because as much as there might be some positive versions of anti-Semitism, like Jews are all smart, family-oriented or something, for the most part, Jews can't adopt in most of the United States, and Jewish kids of Jewish parents, I don't think there's such a thing as a Jewish kid. So they're the same Christian idea is either that same kind of conception is they're placed in Christian families so that they can be raised properly and saved as children, or because a well-meaning social worker, so there's sort of two versions here, a well-meaning social worker knows they'll never get adopted, so they'll forge the records and turn them into Christians. So these are still common practices today, and then you hear about the Christian theological origins of hundreds of years of practice.
Sorry, one more point. I'm really glad that you brought up 9/11, and something, I don't know who here has read Nadine Neighbors' work on Arab Americans and racialization, but something that moved me so much when I was reading it, I was like, wow, this sounds so much like Jewish American history. The kind of flip-flopping status of white, non-white, the fact that Arab Americans were in many ways, until 9/11, excluded from coalitions around racism and not seen as legitimate participants in conversations around racism. And then due to like a very swift change of events, are suddenly seen as like the exemplars of targets of racism. And to the point where people don't even remember that partially because many Arab Americans have done well financially, or done better financially than other minorities, that for a long time they were not considered legitimate minorities in like left progressive circles. And I think that one more aspect of like integrating Jewishness into our analyses, especially of the post 9/11 world, is to take Edward Said seriously in his article Arab and Jew, when he's like, any analysis of Arabs or Jews has to take the other into account. And I'm like, yes, girl, I'm here for you, but lots of people are citing you and are not. Right, exactly.
I don't know that I have a helpful well. I mean, as this conversation is happening, I'm having this other conversation in the Jewish studies field, and just thinking about how I think the other thing that's happened, this may or may not be of interest to you, is that sometimes Jewish studies is so in its own sort of assigned set of what is officially like discussed or not discussed, and also what questions are either given or not given, that I feel there isn't really enough looking around and coalition building, like from both an academic perspective and unfortunately sometimes you do a lot more but in communal bases as well. So I guess the thing that I'm thinking about is what are the kinds of accepted like stories that are told about like Jewish victimhood, you know, that could be so much the same thing subjected to, like, oh, you're telling this story and it's about like how exceptional Jewish victimhood is, but if you were to look at the patterns that created the Jewish victimhood that Jews are often very familiar with, and those things are true, then if you understood those dynamics, you would understand all these other kinds of things that are happening. So I feel like for me, it really does move in these like very much in two directions. And one of the reasons why I want to be here and generally is because I think that there is kind of an echo chamber over there too sometimes.
I'm so glad that you brought up coalition building. To me, like, part of my investment in having students leave the classroom with an awareness of Jewishness and have Jewish students leave with a complicated awareness of their own Jewishness is because I think historically in the US, coalition among white-skinned Jews and non-Jewish people of color has both been really productive and very difficult, and I think in the present is often especially difficult around Israel and Palestine. But I think that one of the great driving forces of that difficulty is a total unawareness of both by many Jews and by many non-Jews of the complicated history of Jewishness. And I hope that if my students leave the classroom with an awareness of how all these types of oppression not only coexist with each other but co-form each other, that they are better able to see each other as coalition partners and see the common grounds for coalition. And that is something I feel is so missing in today's feminist academia and in like the world of progressive activism in general.
Can you give us a specific example of something you think that feminists often are getting wrong because they're leaving out Jews from their sexuality in their analysis?
Sure, it happens all the time to me. I think, okay, so often, at least in the West, patriarchal paradigms and gendered paradigms are presented in a particular way. And if you do other regions on the globe, you know that there are multiple different kinds of ways that gender is constructed that may still end up as patriarchal, but we have this way of consistently reiterating the gender norms in the West, right? So you can walk into any intro to feminist studies class and you say, okay, give me, what are the stereotypes, blah, 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 and everyone knows them as if they're true. Hopefully you get to the point where they know them as in a critical way, but they all know them as truths of the norms. So Jewishness is very diverse, whatever, but at least in terms of the history of my particular community, I'm from northern Eastern Europe. So for example, in my community, one of the reasons, I think that Jonathan was saying some things, and why one of the reasons that Jews have had a history of being an anti-Semitic trope of Jews as sexually perverse is because we messed up Christian Western understandings of gender. So for example, of course, most people were poor and most people had to work, blah, blah, blah. But the elite version in my community was that men would be scholars, right? And so they were feminized, and women actually worked for money. So this is not the norm because most people had to work and blah, blah, blah. And this is not the norm in the local world. I'm just telling you an example. So in that example, women actually, and this is where some of the anti-Jewish women stereotypes come from. So women, although again most Jewish women were as illiterate as everybody else around them, but Jewish women historically have always been more literate than all of the communities around them. And in part that was not only because of Jewish emphasis on text, but Jewish women were not being taught Jewish texts. The reason that Jewish women were more literate is because they ended up in the least elite aspects. They had to run the finances and run the businesses of the family because the elite expectation for the men was that the men were studying, right? So a number of things happened from this. One, they were more literate. Two, they were more literate in the secular, I don't know what the host languages of the countries that they lived in. Tend to be more literate than the Jewish men. So that enabled them to interact more with other people. And that the fact that then they interacted more with other people, whereas most other communities, again, I'm talking about North and Eastern Europe, women were far more secluded, right? So when Eastern European Jews, which are the largest subgroup of American Jews at this point, even though we're a minority in the world, but this is where the American stereotypes come from. So men are scholars and supposed to be spending their all day studying. So they're sort of feminized. Women are seen as aggressive money brokers out in the world of commerce, right? They're far more literate. There's a history of being far more comfortable interacting in the world. And so you get these ideas of the pushy, aggressive, which I'm happy to claim because I'm a Jewish New Yorker intellectual. Also the intellectual history being book-oriented, whatever, so intellectual, etc. So what happens then in the United States? Also, so again, so there's a bunch of stereotypes. So also for us telling us these are the norms in the United States, they're not true. And also if we don't see the ways that they were, one way to see the ways they're constructed in particular ways is to see an alternative example. I'm not saying that the alternative example of the subaltern community, the Jewish community in the United States, is necessarily less patriarchal. That's also a really fun thing to learn. If you want to learn about patriarchy, when I want to learn about patriarchy, I want to learn about the multiple ways patriarchy functions. And if I don't learn about the multiple ways patriarchy functions, then again, my analysis is partially incomplete, etc. So, understanding, for example, this one Jewish, and a lot of Jews will tell you this story, but so this is my burden. Also understanding the way how all those gender stereotypes that we would put up on the board in a Women's Studies 401 type class actually are almost reverse, and yet often still patriarchal. Can tell us so much more about how patriarchy develops, functions, operates in multiple concrete ways, etc. Then, interestingly enough, because Jewish women were uncharacteristically literate, but not literate in what Jews valued. Jews valued religious literacy. Jewish women were exempt, were kept out of the valued sphere. So they did not have Hebrew, Aramaic, Jewish literacy. They had literacy in the languages of the host countries. So when Jews came here, and with an emphasis on learning, it was disproportionately Jewish women who were able to make use of so-called different avenues of universal education in the United States. So also when you get, and you wonder why there are so many Jewish women in certain kinds of things, and you're thinking it's because Jews own the world, right? Or you think it's just because Jewish women are pushy, right? There are specific reasons that you'll find more Jewish women in more literate places, and you'll find them more, they're not necessarily running Fortune 500 companies. They are social workers, they are teachers, they're still doing secular versions of what are valued in the Jewish community. But they weren't allowed. In the past, the rabbi or whatever was the social worker, was the teacher, right? Was the spiritual advisor, was all like the rabbi functioned differently in Eastern Europe. Women now in the US in a secular context have access to those. So you end up in a situation where new immigrant populations are going to come up against, for example, the social work establishment. And there's going to be tensions because it's a very difficult thing, and they're going to run into lots of white or European heritage Jewish women. But the fact of that, and on trying to work on that, you're not going to get anywhere at trying to really work on issues of deportation and immigration and caring refugee processes if you don't understand the history of how so many Jewish women came to be in those places, what they think they're doing and how they think they're living out a fantastic set of values, and that they need a reorientation. Right? And I can go on another one. Reproductive justice. Abortion is not necessarily illegal in Jewish law. There are a lot of contraception is not allowed, but certain kinds of contraceptives are allowed. So the whole U.S. thing about abortion, reproductive justice, contraception is such a Christian, oh my God, it's like such a Christian thing. Jewish women and Jewish organizations, not only Jewish feminist or women's organizations, since like the 1800s, Jewish organizations, not just Jewish women's organizations, have been in the lead of reproductive, in this case I'll say rights. Now what is interesting is that, so Jewish women used to be the primary targets of sterilization efforts, eugenics, things that we know have been switched from reproductive rights to reproductive justice. Right, are you all in on the reproductive rights, reproductive justice? Okay, but the organizations didn't necessarily shift with that, right? And so, but when these organizations are challenged, Jewish organizations are much more likely to be able to start to shift. There's a chapter on this in the book. More likely to shift from that, again, it was well-meaning, history, in almost every single reproductive rights battle, has been a lineup of every major civic. Jews in the United States are an organized people because we come from a corporatist model in Eastern, most of us from Eastern Europe. So, a lineup of every Jewish major organization, completely behind everything about electoral politics, finding the pro-choice candidates, all this sort of stuff. Then we butt up against a situation of new people saying, not new people, but people putting one foot back on reproductive rights agenda, issues of sterilization, environmental degradation, eugenics, right, people of color, which then appears like Jewish organizations are old-fashioned and racist. But if you follow it, all it takes is when those groups attempt to make, and I am shocked because a lot of these groups now are run by really kind of wealthy, it's been their work for so long. A lot of these are like white-skinned European heritage Jews, like in elite, like city families, running these organizations, making sure that they're on a political, electoral candidate's agenda, etc. So you think you're going to come up against, like there's this imagination you're up against this like conservative whatever. Every single time I have seen it, and I've done the research and walked into these offices, you bring up the issue and then you reference back Jewish histories of sterilization, eugenics, etc. Those organizations shift faster to open up a reproductive justice agenda than almost every other, than Planned Parenthood, than almost every other one, because it's easy to reference Jewish history. So those are two. I mean, I could talk endlessly. You can tell I love this stuff. Sorry, this is what else. But you can see how it can work. You give me almost any issue, you can see how you can you have to undo and then you can replace it, and how something may appear like something, and then we can sometimes act as if that's true. But if you just understood the history, you just approach something a little different way, and then you'd have huge organizations on your side, which is what's been happening.
So to build off of that, so to go back to the example Marla brought up about like different Jewish gender norms. First, I think that's a really great way to integrate into conversations about the social construction of gender and like the idea that gender norms are different in different places. I also think it's such a valuable way to find resonance between the assimilation experience of Jews and the forced assimilation experience of Native Americans that actually, historically, were occurring at relatively similar moments. Like Jewish legal emancipation in Europe, and then immigration to the U.S., comes at the moment of a lot of the expansion of gendered violence and gender normatization of indigenous people in the U.S. And in both cases, the demand is you must conform your gender system to our gender system, our ideas of how many genders there are and how they're supposed to act and how they're supposed to have sex and how families are supposed to be arranged. And if you don't do that, we will not acknowledge you, we will commit violence against you, we will see you as unfit parents, we will take children away from you.
Because you're not right, you're not fully human, so you don't deserve parental rights.
Yeah, and specifically not fully human in ways that have to do with
Christ.
Family forming. Oh, Christ, yes, yes, he's always at the party. The specific demands for assimilation along racial and cultural and religious lines that are filtered through gender and sexual agendas. Another point where I think our analysis is incomplete and would be enriched by thinking about Jewishness is to think about the ways that sometimes marginalized groups are not accused of being inferior, they are accused of being superior in threatening ways. And I think, so when I read Melanie K. Kantrowitz's work, I totally recommend it. Some of you have heard me talk too much about her.
Never talk too much.
Yeah,
About Melanie.
About Melanie, our friend Melanie. So she points out, one of the reasons that anti-Semitism is so hard to talk about is that one of the biggest anti-Semitic stereotypes is that Jews are wealthy and in control. And how do you, if you are in a room of people who believe that you are wealthy and powerful, how do you say that's a negative stereotype? And even though I think it's right and important that a lot of our analysis is teaching students to think about the sort of negative or pejorative connotations in media or literature or politics, etc., we also need to understand, and we'll need our students to understand, how stigma and violence and legal restrictions often also function through discourses of threatening superiority. And the other thing to add to that is a thought about the way that historically Jewish oppression is experienced in cycles. And so like Melanie K. Kantorowicz writes about essentially cycles of prosperity and safety, and then cycles of chaos. And I think in conversations about Jewishness in the US in the present, and also conversations about Jewishness in Israel and Palestine, there's this notion of like, everything's fine now, what are you talking about? And one, I would argue that that's actually not true, like everything is not fine when swastikas are drawn in Swarthmore University's or Swarthmore College's library, and when there are shootings at Jewish community centers. But things are comparatively fine to how they were like 50 years ago, and the shortness of that memory scares me. Especially, and I think part of that shortness of memory is fed by a general like inattention to Jewish history, in which like Jewish life in Germany before the Holocaust and Jewish life in Spain before the Spanish Inquisition were historically some of the most integrated and economically prosperous moments, which is not my way of saying like, I think Donald Trump is Hitler, although his hair is pretty terrifying. But it is my way of saying I think that an awareness of this history would, I think, allow better dialogue around some of the most difficult and intractable issues around like what Jewishness means in the US and how Jewishness is related to other forms of marginalization.
Thanks for this conversation. This may tie into Lynn's point about kind of the potential silos or echo chambers on kind of on both sides, right, on the Jewish studies side and the WGSS side. But I wonder how you think about, or if it's necessary to think about, the tension perhaps between kind of the intellectual argument I'm hearing that Jewishness is important, is a useful case study for thinking about intersectionality, and a political context in which intersectionality has become kind of a dirty word for much of the American Jewish community, given the way that it's been used to form certain kinds of coalitions, anti-Israel, et cetera, kind of politics. And how you think about that, kind of using Jewishness as a case study for intersectionality on the one hand, versus a Jewish community that for political reasons is not receptive right now to talk of intersectionality.
So I really hear what you're saying, especially after the announcement of the recent Black Lives Matter platform. It was really painful for me to read a lot of the fallout articles and blogs on all different sides of the debate, but many of those articles were written by more or less progressive Jewish forums that were essentially like, what's this word intersectionality? This is nonsense, and now people who should really be understanding Jews are mad at us, and this sort of terrible oversimplification. And it was really painful for me to look at this community that in many ways so much Jewish education that I grew up with is focused on like, even if you don't keep kosher, even if you like sneak the shrimp at the buffet, that shrimp is not kosher. That you know, like if you take nothing else from your 10 dreadful years of slow Hebrew school lessons, that you should be invested in social justice, and then to hear these communities be like, well, it's intersectionality, like we're mad at it. But then, so to feel so isolated and silenced in those spaces, especially around topics of Israel and Palestine, and then to turn to feminist spaces and to also feel the hand in my face saying you can't talk. Like there is no space to discuss what Jewishness means in intersectionality, and to feel caught between two communities who, for many reasons at this historical moment, seem so incapable of processing each other's paradigms in ways that would allow dialogue. And so I guess my answer to you, Isaac, would be I hope that by opening space in intersectionality theory to think about Jewishness, that can be a bridge for making paradigms legible to each other across the like progressive but not necessarily feminist and queer-oriented Jewish community and the not so Jewishly oriented feminist and queer community.
And my experience has been that there are all these like I deal a lot with rabbis, including some very traditional ones, and they often have this self-perception. First of all, the liberal is good, Like that's a pat on the back there. But then within that, they will cite moments of, let's say, I used to live in this city and we did this thing around housing, or I used to live in this place and we did this thing around minimum wage. And they perceive themselves as good actors, even as they are confused and maybe, I think, not making enough effort to understand it. Like if there's a word they don't understand, then they should inquire about what it means, because probably they can get on board with it. So my feeling is that there is a lot of potential for using the self-perception of being a good actor to expand what you're, into I think more constructive work. You could look at it a different way and say, oh my God, they're so self-satisfied about having done the housing thing, But I actually think that there's this other aspect, which is once there is this self-perception, it can't. And if the problem was, and I don't occupy a lot of space on the in social media, so I get sort of sheltered from some of these things that happen. I didn't realize that the Jews got upset about intersectionality. I just didn't even know that had happened. But I have confidence that if we just describe what this insight gives us, then people will be like, oh yeah, because I had, and then the whole story, and then I don't know. I mean, I could be completely naive here, but I don't think it should be intractable. I think people get hunkered down when they think they're getting threatened, and it prevents the ability to feel strong enough to make a move. So sometimes it's beneficial to sort of help people feel not attacked, or whatever it is that they need to do there, so, by explaining, or just being in the right language at the right time.
I think these comments were totally great. I can have some of my own experiences to what you've already shared, which is one of the reasons I did this book is because actually plenty of Jews are involved in and at the forefront of the creation of the concept of intersectionality, both in academia and on the ground as activists. And yet, given some things we've referred to and we can talk about more later, there is basically no work on Jews, anti-Semitism, or issues of Jewish import in intersectionality work. There's a couple of articles which mention, there's some things about intersectionality in the paradigm in Israel, which looks at, farm workers or something. That's not, I'm not calling it Jewish work, because it's just, it's like Guatemala, whatever, okay. So those are case studies in comparative politics. In the United States, occasionally it's referenced. The only references I've seen are the most conservative references, like ultra-Orthodox responses to school board zoning or something like that. So again, as you need to know, the majority, it's fine, orthodoxy, if that's what your thing is, but it just happens to be, which most people don't know, orthodoxy, let alone ultra-Orthodoxy, is a very tiny fraction of the American Jewish community. So that these are the only images, generally, there is nothing written about Jews, anti-Semitism, or Jewish issues in intersectionality at all. A couple of references are those kind of references, which are they're not necessarily, in those cases, they're not necessarily wrong and factually, but they're very skewed. So part of the reason for writing this is, and again, part of what I say in there is in my field, in feminist political theory and whatever, everybody knows when I'm a Jew in the room, there's some other Jews, but they don't do Jewish stuff, whatever, so I'm always going to ask a Jewish question or whatever. That's fine. People are really respectful. I have good relationships with people in my field academically, as an activist, whatever, but when it comes down to the work, they all know, they know my work, they'll cite my whatever, but not in intersectionality context. So one thing that's happened is that intersectionality activists have cut off any relationship with Jews and Jewish issues. I need to leave that. Now, put aside that with some of the recent stuff that's been about equating everything Jewish with oppressor, given the Israel-Palestine thing, and that's not always the case with us when it comes out. And partly what happens is, I beg to differ, I'm just going to say it this way, the majority of Jews in America are not freaked out about intersectionality. They're either clueless people like your Aunt Sally, and we all have Aunt Sally's, what are we going to do? They're just clueless, ordinary Americans. Or they're activists, they're activists who are already doing the work. Jews are still disproportionately, as I mentioned, at the front lines of almost every progressive radical, movement in the United States. They're all in there doing it, right? Or if they're it's not that all Jews are freaked out about intersectionality. Part of what's happened is that, as I mentioned, the Jewish community has a serious way of being organized with significant civil. They're almost never religious. Again, you need to understand this. The organized Jewish community is largely civic organizations, and so the leaders of those. We also have a lot of Jewish newspapers. We have a lot of Jewish communication networks because that's part of being an organized community. And so certain people who have access to as public personas, right? They're the ones who speak up and act all freaked out. And then you hear in the media loves tension and craziness, so the media responds. It is really my feeling that ordinary Jews they're clueless to actually involved in intersectionality work. It's mostly the people who get represented in the media. It's like saying, the problem of criticizing feminism at any particular time as a white women's movement, when it was white women who were being the ones who were being filmed or being given access, when actually the majority of the movement was completely multiracial. So it was a problem for a while when people were saying feminists were saying the movement is white, from saying the people who get represented in the media are white. Those are two really different stories. Now then what happens, I'm going to give you a personal example. When this began to hit, which was in the way that you're talking about, was literally a year ago, and the head of a major Jewish organization with smaller branches across the entire country was new in his job, and he wrote an op-ed criticizing intersectionality for an event that happened at, I don't know if it was the Brown incident or something like that. He didn't understand intersectionality. So also the other thing is, so that people at the head who are not grassroots activists they don't know anything about intersectionality. So what they're hearing from it is when it gets represented in the Jewish media. So this guy writes, so this is partly how this started. This guy writes an op-ed. He actually doesn't know anything about intersectionality, but he writes this sort of scourge. Immediately when he writes this scourge, his colleagues who are a little lower on the totem pole and more connected to activist communities try and gently point out to him, now they have jobs to worry about, but they point out to him that actually you don't really understand what intersectionality is. So they send him to a person like me, who's connected to the Jewish organizational world, but they don't pay my salary, I don't have to worry about it, I'm a tenure professor, blah, blah, blah. So then what happens is, and I'm not saying it's all about me, but this is just like a great example. So what happened is this guy who excoriated intersectionality and created a whole thing about it, actually what happened when he was put in touch with me, what he wanted to know from me is he wanted me to he had realized he had had enough internal, this was only a few weeks, right? What he realized is people told him, you're not really getting it. What he wanted to know from the me person was actually, what the heck is it? What's going on? And so then what happens is that they bring me, believe me, I am not like a fancy, well-paid, public Jew in that way. But this is a perfect example. Enough people in my activist circles kept saying, have you spoken to Marla Brettschneider? Okay? So, and I'm telling you, I'd like it to happen all the time, but it doesn't happen all the time. But so that's why I can tell you with a little bit of humility instead of as all patting myself on the back. You may think I'm patting myself on the back, but basically I'm actually sharing a good example with a little bit of humility, because I'm not I'm relatively famous, but I'm not super famous. As my sister likes to say, famous in a very small circle of friends. When I was in grad school, I'd be walking somewhere, oh, they're so famous. All right, so I'm not going to tell you this organization. This organization has this plenary where people from around the country come. They invite me to give a talk, and they are clear, and they prep me, and they were so worried about me. I was worried about them. I'm what kind of right-wing crazies am I going to be, because I have similar, at this point. The truth is they were not right-wing crazies. What they wanted to know is they wanted to understand what the phrase, they had no real idea. As much as it's been around for a long time, a lot of them who are not in this kind of academia, not in these activist circles, at this point they're white-collar jobs in Jewish institutions. They had no idea what it was. until all the stuff boiled up, which this guy helped make bubble up. So this guy invites me, I'm just like, I'm not gonna tell you his name. I'm not gonna tell you I particularly like his politics, or that I think he's a great job or a great strategist. But as a good example of someone who's not a great strategist and that I don't like his politics, what he wanted me to do is he wanted me to make sure, he wanted me to teach the people at the conference, who are all over the country running Jewish organizations, what it was and what are the real risks and whatever. He wanted to undo his article, basically, and train all of his people. And that's like the inside version of what happens Jewishly. So of course you will still get some critiques in the Jewish media or whatever. Of course you'll still get that, but that isn't the whole story. And if I hadn't experienced it firsthand, I don't know what I'd be saying to you right now. But it's been happening since, and so since then, more people, I haven't been brought out to more cities, but people still keep reaching out to me. Again, also in part, because this pathetic little book as it is, it's hard to be abnegating, but this one little book is the only book on Jewish anything and intersectionality at all. It wasn't written for this period. As you know, academic books, it was written in a completely different historical moment. I had no idea that I would have written a completely different book. This book is completely inadequate for the current moment. Just tell you, still might want to read it. It's so good about some things. But it was written and submitted for publication. It takes years to do academic publishing. Submitted to the press for the publication process years before this thing happened. Though there's clear warnings in this book over and over again that if we don't start bringing together Jewish analysis and intersectionality, radical politics work, X and Y is going to happen. And that's, I hate political scientists who are predictor people. I'm not that kind. But here I'm going to tell you that I said if it doesn't happen, X is going to happen, and that's exactly what happened. This is the only friggin' book. And it's totally not, it's like an old academic-y, really boring, kind of not, maybe John will say something, book. It's not at all written, but it's the only book out now, given that it's become such a hotbed thing. So now I'm both excited and I'm a little bummed because I wrote the wrong book.
So build off of that, sorry, I'll be quick. And to go back to Isaac's point, I'm really glad you brought up the sort of backlash around the concept of intersectionality, and especially in reaction to the Black Lives Matter platform, because I think this moment, which has gotten a lot of air time, is another example in a very long recurring pattern of Jewish Americans and African Americans being presented in the media as the two main enemies, as if racism in America is like the main fault of the Jews and the Jews are the main reactionaries, and as if the anti-Semitism in America is like the main fault or production of African Americans. And as far back as like the early 1980s, late 1970s, Jewish feminists, including Melanie K. Kantrowitz, wrote very compellingly that that's not true, but it makes a great media story. And one of the reasons that it's, in my opinion, that it's so easy for these moments to keep resurfacing is both because of a general Jewish American unawareness about the complex origins of our whiteness and our complex interrelation with other minorities, and also because a lot of progressive spaces have paid no attention to Jewishness, and I think that's one reason why these sorts of explosions keep happening, and it continues to be.
And I also add that it stirs the status quo, because it keeps blacks and Jews appearing like they're fighting instead of working together to fight the actual problems of the hegemonic order.
Yeah, I think that's, yes, exactly.
Somebody had a hand up.
So this intersectionality conversation is really interesting for a number of reasons, but then I've been finding myself asking, okay, so when we're thinking about this, looking at this slide that's up here, why teach about Jews and Jews, right? Why teach about Jews, arguably in sort of any context that's not necessarily Jewish studies, and dance studies, often the one of the few people when I'm thinking about these questions. So I'm curious about this, where religion and culture intersect, and do we need to be talking about this in terms of legibility, even within intersectionality, because so much what we're talking about in terms of like social justice and all of this comes out of, it doesn't only come from sort of the Eastern European communist immigrant wave of the early 20th century, but certainly that's one very easy historical thread to bring it through. And that so much of that is not necessarily religious, but so often when thinking about Jewish legibility, or non-Jews legibility of Jewish things, or even Jews legibility of Jewish things, that there isn't always this understanding that sort of like observance, that religious observance and social justice, or religious observance in Jewish culture, or religious observance and sort of Jews in a racialized space, any of these things, that even that discussion sometimes needs to be teased apart. And often, I think sometimes a lot of the invisibilization of Jews and Jewish things comes from sort of this question of, well, isn't Jewish a religion, or is Jewish a culture? And I'm wondering if you could speak to, all of you, but you can choose Claude's version. But I'm wondering kind of where that, I'll call it a moment as opposed to a problem or an issue. But where does this sort of the legibility of sort of Jewishness as religion, Jewishness as culture, secular Jew, right? Like totally secularism, and like I think back to that, like the Ellen DeGeneres Coming Out episode from her sitcom, where she like talks to her parents on the show, and she comes out to them, and they say to her, "Are you seeing anyone?" And she says, "No, I'm not." And they say, "Can you be gay without being gay with someone else?" So like this question, like, can you be Jewish without being Jewish? So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to this question of like religiosity, secularism, Jewish culture writ large within this problem of intersectionality.
I can try to take a stab at it. I think it goes back to Linda's original question about how Jewishness is sometimes illegible in intersectional paradigms because it doesn't fit clearly into any one of those categories and can't be clearly named as religion or color or culture. I also think that in the U.S. today in general, under our current racial regime, but also specifically in feminist studies, Jewishness gets discussed only as religion and therefore dismissed from conversations about racialization, even among people who should know better. And when I say that, like as an example, a few times I've been in conversations around racialization, like chatting with other grad students or friends, and brought up Jewishness, and the immediate reaction is, "Oh, I'm not talking about religion." And so the conceiving of like Jewishness as almost like Protestantism or Catholicism, or just like another like religion that you paste onto like skin that needs sunblock, is a limiting factor. And what really struck me, I remember this conversation where a person said to me, "I haven't read the literature, but I'm not talking about religion." And it really hit me. I'm not surprised that people of different backgrounds have different views of what Jewishness means. It consistently surprises me in feminist studies that people who are not Jewish think they can speak authoritatively about what Jewishness means if they haven't done their reading. Because, I just imagine if I were to sit here and say about any group like, I, John Branfman, I'm going to say what it means to be Asian American in America and how that qualifies Asian Americans to theorize about race or not. Which is,
When I haven't done reading.
When I haven't done the reading. And I don't even feel I need to do the reading before I say that. And I hope that segment of the video doesn't get cut and pasted on YouTube. But I feel that is consistently, both implicitly and explicitly, said to Jews, and to go back to your question, under the assumption that it is legitimate and authoritative to say that Jewishness is just a religion that white people have.
I'm just really still learning here because I don't really understand why religion is out of bounds in the conversation. That's because I haven't read enough yet, I'm sure. I'm trying to learn your culture, basically. So I don't understand why it's out of bounds because because commitments that people have within and again, Judaism as a religion that is a new idea because the notion of religion comes after something you might call Judaism, and Judaism itself has had many names, so very complicated within Jewish studies how we construct this. Very interesting, possibly, if you were interested in like a comparison with something else. But so it's nation is also a later idea, and Judaism, some form of it precedes it. But okay, but like for people now who live within some kind of set of Jewish religious structures, whether they be progressive forms of Judaism or traditional forms of Judaism, ultra-Orthodox forms of Judaism, those things are like one of the big things that constructs their identity. So I don't, and then comes into conflict with being like gay or trans or a woman who has an intellect or a whole bunch of things, or a man. Like all the, I don't know, these are only a few things, but so it feels to me like, as I'm learning a little bit about what it is to think in these ways, that this should be a category, though I understand that it isn't. So I'm trying to understand that more, because I don't really understand. You'll tell me, so tell me why it isn't, because I don't know that yet.
All right, so I want to first respond to you and then more directly to the question. So to the degree that there is a religious component in some way, followed or not, in Jewishness, which I'll call Judaism, just for ease sake, it is a problem that of the ways that Judaism is set aside as not dealt with. Because almost everyone in feminism has studied, anyone who's worth their salt in feminist studies has studied the history of the Black church, has studied especially the history of the Black church as a movement for social change, has had to put up with the sexism and homophobia and certain aspects of the conservative agenda of the Black church, but that gets overridden by the what's also understood as the resistive paradigm to white supremacy of the Black church. That doesn't that doesn't translate into Jewishness. So, and Judaism as a religion, to the degree that it's a religious paradigm, and it's far from like utopian, it doesn't have, as if it doesn't have, homophobia, whatever, like, the same thing doesn't happen because of a lot of the issues that we're talking about here, about a certain kind of stopping of the exploration when it comes to Jews. But more what I want to say in response directly is, in my view, it's a form of genocide that happens through domestic cultural imperialism that we know by the name assimilation. Okay? As Juliet alluded to, so first of all, Jewishness, most Jews, certainly most Jews in the United States, don't identify in what you might call as in a religious manner. This doesn't necessarily mean anything about their practices. I, for example, self-identify as secular. This is all possible in a Jewish context. It's not necessarily as possible in certain other contexts, but I'm still going to take off Rosh Hashanah and do Rosh Hashanah-y things. They might be radical, whatever they're going to be. I'm still going to participate in certain Jewish rituals, which I love, and I know Hebrew, and I'm going to sing, whatever. I identify as a secular Jew. This is not in the slightest bit of contradiction in Jewish context. Most Jews, according to even the most current study, when you ask Jews how they identify what is Jewish, I wish I had my stats in front of me. This is the little social scientist in me, a little bit of social scientist in me. But most Jews, according to recent Pew surveys and other things like that, identify curiosity, intellectual, questioning, sense of humor, the Holocaust, social justice work, not exactly in this order, but social justice work maybe first, literally intellectual, social justice work, intellectual curiosity, humor, down towards the bottom, there's eventually when you get past around 5 is the Holocaust, lower is Israel, and eventually is religious concerns. That's how Jews self-name what Jewishness is. Now, why is that not known? Many Jews don't know it if they're not brought up in Jewish context, but why is that not what you all, if you're not Jewish, what you all don't understand as Jewish? Because, as Julian mentioned, Jewishness as a religion is a Christian paradigm. Jewishness doesn't, and it started in France and Germany in the 1700s and moved into the 1800s. In the development particularly of Protestantism, so France is a little bit of a different thing, but because of the development of the French emancipation, I could go on and on. This is one of my favorite topics. I'm a political philosopher. So what happened at a certain point with the development of Protestantism, as you all know, of the separation of church and state, of the separation between conceptions of the citizen, the human, and religious life, Jews didn't fit that pattern. This was not a problem of Jews, I'm speaking again in a European context, this was not a problem of Jews in Eastern Europe, because in Eastern Europe, state, home, religion, those were all, with the Orthodox Church, those were all merged. This is a creation of Western European philosophy, which is where the United States still is. Okay? With the creation of Protestantism, with the separation of religion out of other spheres of life, Jews didn't fit. Because Jews lived with all of these mushed in. That was what Jewishness was, as I just mentioned what Jewishness is. Religion is part of it, whatever. So as a part of trying to work on issues of anti-Semitism, as you well know, often if there's difference, the reaction to difference by the hegemonic group is to discriminate in more and less forms to the targeted group. Of course, as we all know as feminists, there's another option. You can, so what usually happens to end the discrimination, you end the difference. That's certainly the American paradigm, and it comes from the Western European paradigm. Of course, as feminists know, what you could do when difference equals discrimination is you can end the discrimination and leave the difference, right? But that's not the Western liberal paradigm. So when this came up in Eastern Europe and Jewishness did not fit the new Protestant paradigm, and there was unbelievable anti-Semitism in the French Enlightenment trying to decide, should Jews be considered citizens in the new conception of liberalism, different kind of liberalism after the French Revolution, it was decided that if Jews could separate out, this is an impossibility, but this is the way things go, if Jews in the whole language, and it was said by a dude in the French Parliament, if they can be Jews at home and a man in the street, then they can be citizens. Of course, it was a patriarchal paradigm, it was a heterosexist paradigm, blah, blah. It was a head of family, it was a classist notion, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that, in terms of this notion about not understanding, is not only a Christian notion, it's a heterosexist notion, it's a patriarchal notion, it's a classist notion. This misrepresentation of Jews, right? So what we get now is still, and if you're still wondering why I talk about Christian dominance and Christian hegemony and Christian privilege, is because of very concept. We live in, if you're not looking at alternatives, conscious alternatives to Christianity, for example, like Jewish paradigms, you are not going to see the regimes of power in which you live, in which we all live. So for example, the reason that Jewishness is a confusion of this thing is because Protestantism can't handle it. And to the degree that in America, Jewishness keeps being put in the category of religion, that's an assimilationist paradigm, which in my mind is a form of domestic cultural imperialism, which is the kinder, gentler 50 points of light. It's the kinder, gentler form of genocide. It's like when you took the Native Americans out and you said they could be Christian. They might have been born Native Americans, if I can turn them into Christians, then they'll be okay. Well, you can have Jews, if you're going to have Jews without being Jewish, it's the best they can do. Benjamin Rush did all this about African heritage people. The ways to have the people, but like take out the bad stuff. So some people just want to take out all the people and kill them directly. And some people, the kinder gentler version is to keep the people, but take out everything that makes them so quote unquote Jewish, right? So the origins of that we still live with today, of the constantly Jews are only going to be asked to, at this point in history, there's a confusion if they're white Jews. And again, you need to understand, there are hundreds of thousands of people we call people of color, Jews of color, in the United States alone. White Northern European Jews are a minority of world Jewry. If you don't know that, again, that's part of your indoctrination in the United States Christian paradigms. Because it serves the Christian status quo and white supremacy. At this point, post-Holocaust, post-World War II, it serves Christian hegemony and white supremacy to consider Jews that they had become white folks. But most people are not white folks. They'll never be white folks, and they'll be seen as white folks. And to turn us into a religion just is completely an assimilationist paradigm as a way to cope with a category. But it serves the Christian and capitalist status quo. Part of my issue to all of you is, sorry, I'm going to just say it outright, and it's not just you, it's all of us, so, whatever. I'm a little pushy, but here you go. If you're not dealing with Jewish issues in your feminist intersectionality work, then you are supporting the status quo. If you're not dealing with Jewish issues, you are furthering white supremacy, you're furthering Christian hegemony, you are participating, we all participate, we all know, you are participating in that. And I just gave you a perfect example, right? To the degree that you're not putting Jews on your multiracial or multi-ethnic community, like whatever, you have committees, whatever, and you designate Jews for maybe an interfaith. Interfaith itself is a Christian paradigm, it's not a Jewish paradigm, right? So again, another fact of sort of cultural assimilation, genocidism, etc. If you're going to put your Jews only in a interfaith paradigm, let alone in religious context, you yourself are participating in genocide. Next question.
Is there time for, I know people are probably tired, but I do have a question. I don't know if you all have stands on for one last.
Can we do one more question?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Unless there was something from that side of the room, because we've been like dominating over here. Well, actually, Joy started us off, right? So, okay, cool. So, why teach about Jews in WGSS? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's a no-brainer. The question, why haven't we been teaching about Jews in WGSS? That's the question that I want to think about. So what is the, whether that's Ohio State or whatever context in which,
Right, you're far from alone. So every time I say you, please know, it's like us
Yeah.
in the big sentence.
yeah. So I'm just thinking about my undergrad in feminist studies, and the Yours and Struggle was, required reading, the intro to women's studies. So what happened from the 90s to right now? And so I'm curious about your thoughts about that. And some of the things that I'm thinking about in part intersect with the fact that I don't teach about the US context. I teach about transnational and global stuff. And as a Slavist, for me, Jews are always at the center because of Russia and Eastern Europe. So what is it in the US context that has led to the obfuscation of Jewish identity, Jewish feminism, and organizing? And I'm wondering about, you said earlier, Marla, about how you wrote the book about multiculturalism, and now you're sort of redoing, like you're kind of back where you started, doing with intersectionality. So what is it specifically about these discourses that are facilitating certain kinds of thinking about difference? And so one thing that I've thought about in the past, and I wonder if it relates to this topic, is the ways in which, in the 80s and 90s, women's studies became global. And in that moment of becoming global, there was a way to talk about, in particular, racial difference. So transnational or global actually coded as women of color, women from the global south. And so in that shift or in that move of globalizing, of seeing an absence that were too American-centric, there was a kind of a continuation of a way of thinking that was still quite US-based, right? And hence this word multiculturalism is still a very US understanding of difference. So I'm wondering about that, whether you see traction there. In addition, just the ways in which I see, even within global transnational, that in fact Europe and Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Eurasia is basically not part of the global either. And so I also see a reason for that. And I think part of the reason is because, at least in the US, there's a real critique, a very strong critique, even coming from someone who is an Arab Jew, is Ella Shohat, right? So there's a problem of Eurocentrism, right? So how can we sort of both see the reasons for why we want to critique Eurocentrism, and maybe where Jewishness fits within that, but then also the clear obfuscation, right, that you all have articulated so beautifully today. So not why do we teach? Yes, we teach, but why have we not been teaching?
I'll do my best to start. I think there are two main reasons that suggest themselves to me. One is that in the U.S. in the present, Jews of European descent are most often seen as white, and that as much as we love to protest against categories, we are humans who are conditioned socially to want to think in categories, and it is much easier to draw a clear line between white people and people of color, and to theorize oppression and privilege that way, and much less convenient, both in our thinking and our coalitional politics, to deal with the ways that some groups, including Jews, but not only Jews, resonate in weird, fluctuating ways on both sides of that. And so and also that in the way that we theorize structural oppression and privilege in feminist studies, very often we're explaining to students, like, here's what oppression means. Oppression means, like, the state is, for example, the state is arresting you en masse, not that this, like, one kid called you a douche in middle school. And I think that when we are describing when we draw that huge dichotomy between what we call real oppression on the systemic level and what we sort of dismiss as individualized oppression, we miss the sort of in-between types of violence and stigma that target Jews. And that type, so such as like living in a middle-class community but finding swastikas on your lockers or having your synagogue firebombed or shot up or whatever. And that because of the way that we are theorizing what we're going to count in our analysis, that this in-between type of stigma and violence doesn't appear. I also think a really big structuring presence of the way we talk about Jewishness or don't is Israel and Palestine. And I think that in our field, there is a very, out of a sincere desire for social justice, there is a very specific narrative that is the view of what is happening over there, what the proposed solution should be, and it is easiest to think in that narrative if we view Jews exclusively as white and therefore as easily read as only oppressors. And it is much less convenient to understand the ways both past and present that Jews are and have been, and probably will be again, targets of racialized violence. And bringing those ideas into the conversations risk destabilizing narratives that I think many of us feel very comfortable in.
But since the 90s though, why, if there was a time in which it was more, the basic 101, when the study you're reading, Jewish feminists it's more central to thinking about like working class feminist activism in the US, right? I mean, it's basically a Jewish women's activism. So what can attest just from your thinking maybe, or the shift from the 90s really, right? The 80s and the 80s to the contemporary, simply something big has happened to allow for us to not care about that history in the ways in which we used to be very attuned to it.
I think one part of it, for sure, is 9/11. I think 9/11 impacts our society in all kinds of ways, but there's a fair amount written on how both religiously and racially Jews are now like included more comfortably in the American nation state when Arabs and Muslims are targeted. And I even remember like pre-9/11 growing up and very often hearing the phrase like we are a Christian society, and now very often hearing the phrase we are a Judeo-Christian society, and the ways that in a time when Muslims become the new straw men, and actually are stereotyped in so many of the similar ways that Jews historically have been in the US. And when that sort of straw man figure encourages certain military alliances between the US and Israel, that both for the conservative Christian right and for the progressive political left, it becomes very convenient to either recruit Jews as like on the side of whiteness or to demonize Jews as being on the side of whiteness and to not interrogate those complexities.
I don't think I can speak to this question. The only thing I will say is that if anyone wants to do this work and have a friend in Jewish studies, you can have one. I'll write it to you.
I do think, it's not pretty to say, I do think it's part of this legacy of anti-Semitism on the left in ways that have come to the fore in new ways. In ways that the left has been remiss at actually focusing on a certain level of the hegemonic constructs that it needs to focus on. And I think there's been a little bit of a stepping back. One of my big issues in the Jewish community, again, to the degree that I'm active in like national Jewish organizations, is this constant argument. I think the Jewish community kind of stepped back in this particular period of time in the 90s from offering what Jews were generally accustomed to the major spokespeople of the Jewish community. It was on the ground, Jews running these organizations, but also the Jewish community could always be relied on to offer a critical political analysis of everything, whether from the labor movement, environmental movement, as I said, reproductive justice, etc. And although actually, again, what most people don't know is even most organized Jewish organizations are still active on all those issues. Highest, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which is the one that settled my grandparents from Eastern Europe, right? There's still one of 9. There's only 9 agencies in the United States that deal with the problem of refugee resettlement. Jews are like not even 3% of the population. One of the 9, one of the biggest ones of the 9, is still highest. Jewish organizations, which may not know, whatever, like HIAS is still one of the major groups on the front line with this Jewish legacy and Jewish organizations, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, on the front line of immigrant, especially now, even if they're Syrians. So people think, oh, Jews aren't going to do this for Syrians, but or Muslims. Like, that's just totally not happened. HIAS is totally on the front lines, in Congress, on the ground, doing concrete work for resettlement, concrete work for changing refugee status, etc., like all those things. So, but what happened at a certain point, I think, is there's other ways in which my internal critique, which some people tell me not to say in general audiences, but I'll just say it anyway. I do think there's a way in which Jewish leadership with access to the media has stepped back a little bit from a certain kind of historical in the United States sort of systematic critique of power. And so not everybody knows that. Although Jonathan said what most Jews are getting, even if they don't know anything else, and especially also because the Reform movement is the largest religious movement in the United States, and the Reform movement's main thing is social justice. No offense to people who Reform, they're not really getting a whole lot of religion or ritual. They know almost no Hebrew, like sorry, whatever. But what they all get, and all my Jewish students who know nothing, they all know social justice, they were raised in Reform movements. It's the majority in the United States. So on the ground, it's still what Jews are getting, but I think there's been a little bit of a retraction from the leadership, and I do think in what Jonathan said, I think there's been a shift in the ways, even into the 1970s, Jews were still considered, in the American left, still considered active partners in the Israel-Palestine peace movement. And there's been a shift in that. And in part, I think, because we're using the South African example, where you distance. The problem for that, I mean, I can't really speak to the South African example exactly. I know it's been a problem for some, and I've tried to look into it. But what I can say is that historically, Jews, Muslim, Christians, Druze, Bedouin, etc., Israelis and Palestinians inside Israel, after 67 in the territories, whatever it is, have long had these histories of working together on joint projects to end the situation. Not successful, don't worry, I'm not saying it's like perfect, but the current move to say we have to distance and we have to boycott any kind of interaction means you're separating out the initiatives that have long been, you're like distancing the on the ground activities of people in the movement. I don't know about anybody else, but the peace movement I was raised in is whether domestically, if it's not your issue, or if you have an issue with another community, and specifically internationally, if it's not your issue. The peace movement I was raised in is that you go find the people on the ground working in the peace movement, and you learn from them, and you work and you support them. The BDS movement, which I'm not necessarily saying is a whole problem, like as a whole general, I'm saying these particular strategies. The general strategy right now of the boycott is to say you disconnect from anything happening in Israel, which means you disconnect from the people on the ground doing the work and who need the international support the most. What you're also doing is you're disconnecting from not only the Jews in Israel who are doing that, you're disconnecting from Palestinians who are of a variety of religions, whatever. So what's been happening is there's a shift in paradigm of interacting on the Israel-Palestine issue, whereas Jews and Israelis used to be part of the movement against oppression of Palestinians. There's now a separation. And I think in part of the fear of that, there's been a little bit of a retraction. I hold accountable, and I'm doing it nice here, but when I'm in those Jewish settings and in Jewish organizations, and I said it at this big meeting that I just mentioned before, like I went on and on about the lack of sort of systemic Jewish critique that we need coming from there. So I do think there's an overlap. It's hard to understand why. We don't have a comprehensive understanding, but I think there's
This has been a really rich conversation. I want to thank all three of the panelists for sustaining a really fascinating